So is blockchain more than just cryptocurrencies? I think this is a question we're all asking ourselves, and there is debate over it. People usually present as blockchain being the next internet. I want to show you another perspective. Look at blockchain as the next stage of open source, and open source has transformed the way we write software all over the world, and blockchain, in my eyes, is going to do the same. So a few words about myself first. My name is Tal. I'm the co-founder of Orbs. Orbs is a public permissionless blockchain. It is coming out of Israel. It is probably the largest blockchain project from Israel. My previous position, I was head of mobile engineering in Wix.com. That's where I learned the enterprise. It's a company with 150 million users. So it's a widespread consumer-based company. I'm very passionate about open source. I'm a React contributor. It's a big open source project, one of the top ones on GitHub. And if you would look, Google my name, you will see me speaking in some open source conferences around the world. And you would see some of my libraries used in serious places, like the last mobile app of the Olympics used a library I wrote. And I was also head of engineering for Kin, so I tried to take the first billion-dollar company, consumer company, into blockchain. So, the main takeaway of this talk is that public blockchain will transform the enterprise, just like open source did. So what is the enterprise really, when you ask? So, the European Union defines the enterprise as companies with over 500 people. But if I talk in a crypto conference, you have to define the enterprise as a for-profit business, something that is not a DAO. Most of the businesses in the world are for-profit. So is public blockchain relevant to them? And the answer, in my eyes, is yes. Open source has changed these businesses tremendously. It changed how they write software, and public blockchain is going to do the same. So, do you appreciate how open source changed the enterprise? How open source changed these for-profit businesses, companies like Uber? So if you go to Uber and you ask Uber, what are you using for your cloud operating system? They would say Linux, an open source operating system. If you go and ask them which databases they use, they will tell you we use MySQL, MongoDB, Redis, and stuff like that, all open source software. If you ask them which programming languages you use to write your code, they will use JavaScript, Python, C, Java. All of these languages are open source. The operating system they release their apps on is Android mostly, and this is an open source operating system. And the web applications that they build, they release on Chrome and Firefox, which are open source browsers. So the world is open source. Almost all developer infrastructure is. So the enterprise is not just taking away from open source, it's also contributing back. Because if you look at GitHub and you look who are the biggest contributors to open source today in the world, you will see that this is the enterprise. Companies, I sorted them according to their contribution to GitHub: Microsoft #1, then Google, Amazon, IBM, Intel, Facebook. So these for-profit businesses are contributing open code to the world. And this, in my eyes, is amazing. It's a very big success. Look at libraries like TensorFlow from Google. It's one of the leading AI libraries in the world. React by Facebook changed how the web is being written. And if you look in the enterprise and you see how much of a proprietary system in an enterprise relies on open source code, you will find a staggering number. 57% of the code of a random system written in the enterprise is currently based on open source code. So the open source is everywhere. Now, if we try to compare open source and the public blockchain movement, we will see that they're very similar. We can learn from how open source behaved and make some predictions as to how public blockchain will behave. And we can see this from the beginning of the roots. Both movements started with grand ideals. They were very, very idealistic and started with a dream. So what is the dream of open source? Open source started at '83. It was not called open source then. It was named the Free Software Movement. This is a picture of Richard Stallman. He's the guy who started it all. And it was a campaign for the freedom of the users of computing. Movement for freedom and justice. Not a way to make money, nothing related to business, but a movement of freedom. So how did the public blockchain start? The exact same way. Look at the Web3 movement. Okay, the Web3 movement is another idealistic movement. A new serverless internet, that is centralized web, users in control of their own data, identity and destiny. We don't want to put our data in companies like Facebook or Google. We want to hold it by ourselves. We envision a new world. Lots of ideals. But how do these ideals translate to real businesses, to for-profit businesses? Do these ideals resonate with these businesses? Do they make them make more money? And the answer is no. If you look at how the enterprise, how for-profit businesses responded to these ideals, they did not respond positively. So look at the open source story. Up until '98, the companies in the world looked at the free software movement as something that was trying to destroy their very livelihood. They were afraid of open source, they were afraid of free software. They made their living out of selling licenses to code, and they looked at the Free Software Foundation as the enemy. Microsoft labeled the Free Software Foundation as its enemy, and the Free Software Foundation labeled Microsoft as its enemy. So this did not work well. It was a radical new business model where the IP is free. And how is the for-profit business world responding to public blockchain? Well, if you look at the DApp rush, and you look at what dApps are trying to achieve, you will see that decentralized dApps are actually trying to disrupt the for-profit businesses away. And why is that? Because dApps offer a radical new business model. It's no longer a for-profit model where a few people control a company, but it's a DAO based on a peer-to-peer token economy. Now go talk to a for-profit business, ask them what they think about a peer-to-peer token economy, and they don't know what to do with it. They are rejecting dApps. You don't see any enterprise today or any for-profit business like Uber trying to build a dApp. Okay, there is no dApp adoption whatsoever in this part of the world. And these businesses make out 99.9% of the business world today. So is there a future to public blockchain in this world? And if we won't see a future, I think, this is horrible for our entire industry. But is there light in the end of the tunnel? So the story did not end here for open source. It just started, and it took a little time, and I want to show you how it evolved. So eventually, what happened was that around '98, the free software movement changed, and then the open source movement rose from within it. And the open source movement was not based on ideals anymore. It was not a movement to make the world a better place. It was not a move to make users more free. It was a movement to give practical advantage, and it was based on making more profits, not on principle. And this is important to understand because being more open can make businesses more profitable, and we saw this happening. And I want to give you an example of where you can see this happening in the mobile phone that you currently hold in your hand. Mobile operating systems, and mobile was the most coveted industry to get into in the last 10 years, and you saw that iOS, Apple's operating system, was dominating this field. And many other companies like Microsoft and Google try to go into this field, into this space, and try to control how users go through mobile to the world. And what happened? Who won? Microsoft did not win this battle, Google did. And how did they win? They won with open source. They were based on Android, which is a mostly open source operating system. And this operating system allowed Android to disrupt iOS and rise to over 75% of the market share. And this is insane. And if you attribute this to what? It is mostly to this being an open operating system. So you can see companies, manufacturers like Samsung, using this operating system because they have the code, they can change it, and they don't have to rely on Google to do so. So what did Google let go when they open sourced Android? They forgo the ability to charge money or license to use this operating system, so they lost a little money. But what did they gain? They gained adoption. Android now is found in the pockets of over a quarter of the population of Earth. Okay? And this is the big, big game, and this is the value for Google. And this is what being open can do for you, the network effect. So will we see the same happening for public blockchain? Will for-profit businesses recognize that being more open and using public blockchain technologies will make them more profitable? And the answer, I think, is yes. I think that we will see a new evolution, that the Web3 movement will change from its ideals, just like we saw with open source. And from the ashes of that, we will see a more practical movement coming out of using public blockchain for-profit businesses, not based around the ideal of decentralization, but the ideal of making companies more successful and building better products. And what is the idea behind that? Public blockchain can give us one thing that we don't have in the world today, and that is trust. And trust is important for running the world, and trust is important to companies like Uber, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. Trust is what, if they don't have with their users, they're not going to survive the next 10 years. And public blockchain is the way to achieve this, because public blockchain is the only way to achieve provable trust with technology, and don't trust me just because you like me. Okay, so blockchain is an impartial third-party source of trust, and this has to be permissionless. This is the important thing. The enterprise cannot rely on a private blockchain, on permission blockchain. This misses out the whole point, the entire disruption, because a permission blockchain does not add trust. Trust can only be gained by an incentive model that is provably unbiased. That's how you know everything is abiding by the rules. And it has to be public. Why? Because of transparency, that any user of these systems could audit and see what's going on in there. They could audit the data and the algorithm, just like any one of us can audit what's happening with Bitcoin. And this is why we trust Bitcoin more than we trust any other currency with a monetary policy that we can't control, and we don't know who's moving the things there. So what I offer you is a different metaphor. Look at public blockchain as a direct continuation of open source. If open source allowed us to collaborate on writing a system together, to developers to go together and write an operating system like Android, it stopped in the middle, okay? It did not go all the way through. If you look at the Android operating system, you see that many parts of Android are still closed. We did not reach the ideal of openness that we want to. There is still a way to go, and public blockchain will allow us to do that. Why? Because it allows us not only to collaborate on writing code, but it allows us to collaborate on running it. So blockchain allows to run a system together, a live instance of the system, and share the data. So if you look at Android, think about the parts of Android that are centralized, like push notifications or the Android App Store. These parts are being controlled by Google. They are not open yet, and there is no other way to open them. These are living services. By opening their code, it's not enough. It will not do anything. The only way to open them up is by running them together, and public blockchain can finally do that from a technology point of view. So the future, in my eyes, is that the enterprise is going to start using public blockchain, and I think this is the true disruption of our industry. So I want to show you a little bit of how I kind of like analyze the space so you can see the different solutions out there. So if you look at the horizontal axis separates a bit of the infrastructure. And we can see two types of distinct infrastructure in our space today. We have permissionless infrastructure on the right, which is usually referred to as the public blockchain. That means that the network and incentive model is controlling the nodes. And on the left, we have permissioned infrastructure, or what we sometimes called private blockchain, where we have people choosing who the nodes are, the apps themselves. If we look at the vertical axis, we see on the top permissioned apps or enterprise apps. These are apps created, these are the users of the blockchain, apps created by for-profit businesses. The idea behind these apps is that they're not based on a token. They're not based on a token economy. These are not the apps. So these are the apps that we see today. This is the business world. These are the customers, the potential customers of blockchain. And what do we see on the bottom? We see permissionless apps or dApps. So dApps are based usually on a peer-to-peer token economy. We saw the dApp rush in the last 2 years with all the ICO hype. And if you see the solutions today in the market, you see them concentrated in two places. On the bottom right, you see permissionless infrastructure designed for permissionless apps. And these are solutions like Ethereum, okay? They're designed for dApps. And on the top left, you see solutions like Hyperledger, Corda, and Quorum. These are permissioned infrastructure, okay? The apps control the nodes, and they're designed for the enterprise today. And what I see as the main disruption that we should focus on, and the major opportunity of this entire industry, is to connect the customers are the for-profit businesses, with the disruptive infrastructure, which is the permissionless infrastructure. And this is the top right with solutions like Orbs that I'm part of. And if you try to make this disruption happen, you need to solve a lot of problems. If you go talk to the enterprise and you ask the enterprise, what is stopping you from using permissionless infrastructure, they will give you several answers. And what we have gone and did is solve each one of these problems. So the first issue is cost. And you know that businesses always revolve around cost. And one of the big problems of public blockchain today, infrastructures like Ethereum, that they're very, very expensive. It's not only that they're expensive, they're impossible to predict how expensive it's going to be. Try to get a for-profit business to have a budget for how much his app is going to cost. That's nearly impossible today. The reason is because the more activity there is in the blockchain, for example, CryptoKitties became popular, then the fees are going to be higher. Why? Because capacity does not grow with demand. This is a fundamental problem of public blockchain that we have solved. Another thing is that private blockchain is significantly cheaper. This is another problem that we have fixed. Today, public blockchain with our technology could actually be cheaper than a private blockchain. And this is insane. And why is that? Because somebody else is running the node for you. And if we can devise the incentive model that they're running at cost plus, you basically get a group of node operators that are like minimum wage workers. They're working for the least money possible because there is free competition, permissionless competition among them. And this is very, very good for for-profit businesses. Another big issue that is stopping the enterprise from using public blockchain is privacy. They would tell you public is public. And if you dig into this sphere, you would see that this sphere is mostly irrational. It is close to the fear that corporations had 20 years ago when they thought about connecting to the internet. A corporation did not want to connect to the internet. They said we would connect and then all of our data would be available on the internet. But we know that this was irrational, that this was not true, and the benefits gained by connecting to the internet outweigh the risks. So the same thing is happening today with privacy. If you look at the private blockchain is based around consortiums. Who do you have in the consortium? You usually have your competitors. Who are you trying to hide your private data from, if not from your competitors? So today, in private blockchain, they have privacy solutions employed in place, things like using off-chain encryption, hashes, ZKP. There's a lot of technology there. All of this technology can easily be applied to the public blockchain space, so we can enjoy the collaboration without risking any of the privacy. So privacy is not an issue. What about scalability? Is scalability an issue? Not anymore. Public blockchain, we had a panel about scalability today. Public blockchain seems unscalable, but we have solved this as well. In the past 2 years, lots of public blockchains have created technologies that no longer have the scalability limitations. And what we're doing is two major things to do that. One of them is relying on new consensus mechanisms like ARPOS, is randomized proof of stake. It allows us to use smaller randomized committees from a very large collection of nodes. This basically allows us to solve the trilemma that you can have scale without compromising security and decentralization. Another thing is inherent sharding with a concept that we call virtual chains. Virtual chains allows us to run every app on its own virtual blockchain while sharing the same physical node infrastructure. So you enjoy the entire decentralization of all the nodes that you have in the network, all the permissionless nodes, but it allows every app to scale on its own without affecting one another, which is a very, very important thing. And the last but not least is a control problem. Public blockchain today has a huge, huge control issue. Think about Uber using a public blockchain and think about the DAO bug that we saw on Ethereum. What happened one day was that the network decided that they're going to roll back history. Do you imagine that a company like Uber could use an infrastructure that somebody can roll back history without their consent? I don't think so. And even the opposite is true. Consider what happened with the parity bug. We saw a similar bug with the same catastrophic implications, a security vulnerability, if you want, and the network decided against deploying a patch for it and rolling back history. So what happens if Uber has a security vulnerability and it does not have the power to change the code? So we can solve these things. We can solve the governance issues. We do that by using two-tier consensus, an interesting hybrid between permissioned and permissionless nodes. In a sense, the apps are controlling the block producers, so they have full control of their own histories, and the histories are isolated. And what we get is we use the permissionless nodes to act as validators or notaries to prove that to the world, publicly and audibly, that these apps are indeed doing what they claim that they're doing, that there is somebody else signing these blocks and proving to the world that it's indeed transparent. Thank you. You can learn about what we do by visiting orbs.com, and I wish you a great end of the conference and final party.